Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi is the latest political leader to resign after voters rejected his constitutional reforms in this month's elections. The referendum on Italy's constitution and the presidential election in Austria are examples of the strength of anti-establishment sentiment across Europe. Voters in Austria ultimately rejected the far-right party candidate who championed against immigration and free trade. But populist parties are staging campaigns in France, Germany and the Netherlands for next year's elections. We begin with this report from CCTV's Mariam Zaidi in Brussels.
Another referendum called and another surprise referendum lost. The defeat for Italy's pro-European Prime Minister Matteo Renzi was a coup for the so-called alt-right and the anti-establishment forces. On the heels of the Brexit vote in June, the UK's withdrawal from the European Union and Donald Trump's US presidential election victory last month, many are asking whether Italy will be the next domino to fall in the wave of populism. Could Italy's political drama lead to a new Eurozone crisis?
We are not going to see an Italy exit in a short term, I'm sure of this. It was a referendum in favour or against Mr. Renzi.
Italy, the third largest economic member of the Eurozone, is viewed as a pro-EU state, unlike the UK. For Socialist MEP Claude Moraes, the situation is far too complex to point a finger at just one common denominator: populism.
You're getting people through insecurity, wages not having risen in many countries, Britain is an example, and of course identity politics. People will suffer during this period because the solutions don't lie in demagoguery, blaming other people.
But politics isn't Italy's only problem. There are real concerns over the possibility of a sovereign debt crisis. That, coupled with the momentum provided for anti-establishment groups, could see some very tricky days ahead for Italy.
If populist parties, come to power, they may express a disagreement with the austerity policy of Germany. And will it lead to the break of the euro? No. But will it make our life more difficult? Certainly, yes.
So is a crisis looming? If mainstream Eurocrats can deliver on a better Europe and find a message that speaks to those on the fringes, it may be kept at bay.
And Mariam joins us now from Brussels. And Mariam, what are the core reasons for voter discontent in Italy?
Hi, Anon. Well, the scale of the no vote was almost 60%, so that was a stinging rebuke of constitutional reform. The former Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi staked his political future on referendum, just like another former Prime Minister, the British David Cameron, did, and they both lost. This was a vote essentially by Italians against Renzi and his government. Many saw the reforms as a power grab, not as a moment for change or efficiency. But another thing to remember is that electorates, especially in Eurozone countries, those countries that have had to push through punishing reforms by Brussels and still find themselves, such as Italy does, with a sluggish economy, massive public debt, mushrooming banking crisis and high unemployment, they're vulnerable to the rhetoric of anti-establishment or alt-right parties who promise change but are so far untested at delivering on many of their promises.
Now, how concerned is the European Union about this development and the fact that Britain's exit could perhaps sway other countries to follow that lead?
Well, Italy was one of two big votes over one weekend in early December. The other, of course, was Austria, that commentators predicted would lead to possibly the breakup of the EU or a Eurozone crisis. Now, Austria was a significant win for the EU. The far-right candidate was defeated, but the main part is that he did get close to winning. Now, after the Italian referendum, Europe has reacted positively. Many shot down talks of an Italexit. EU politicians, since the Brexit and certainly after the Italy vote, seem to now understand that they have to win back their voters. Some even have gone so far as to say that populist movements serve as a purpose, that they are a self-correcting tool of society. But EU general elections do take place next year. Netherlands, of course, is up first, and that's being touted once again as a defining moment for the EU project future. But we also need to look ahead to German and French elections. Marine Le Pen has turned her party's fortunes around in France, and there's a real chance that she can actually break through. So the next months are definitely crucial for the EU.
Okay, thanks. That's Mariam Zaidi reporting from Brussels. Joining us now from London is Paola Subacchi. She's a research director of international economics with Chatham House. Here with us in the studio is Ansgar Graw. He's a senior political correspondent with the German newspapers Die Welt and Welt Sonntag. Also with us from Salzburg via Skype is Reinhard Heinisch. He's a professor of Austrian politics and head of the Political Science Department at the University of Salzburg. And from Berlin, we're joined by Dominic Thomas. He's the chair of French and Francophone Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Paola, let me start with you, and let's look at the events in Italy. Prime Minister Matteo Renzi wanted to change the Italian constitution. He put it to a referendum, he lost, and then he resigned. But what was he trying to accomplish, and to what do you attribute the fact that Italians said no?
Well, what he wanted to accomplish is to create a more so-called efficient electoral system, and to reconcile and to resolve the contradictions into the system which which elects the lower chambers and the system which elects the upper chamber. So the two are different, and therefore they tend to give contradictory results, or results that makes governing complicated. So by reforming the upper house, Matteo Renzi thought to and hoped to be able to have a more efficient system, and with which could give a full majority to the winning party.
Dominic, we hear of more and more support going to what are called populist forces in Europe, in Italy as well. Was the outcome of the Italian referendum a boost for these forces?
I think it absolutely was. What we've witnessed in the last 6 months, particularly since the Brexit vote, are some dramatic transformations in the electoral landscape throughout Europe. What we've seen is actually a kind of traditional a sort of dismantling of traditional party structures and the emergence of these populist parties. We saw with the Brexit vote the way in which the UKIP party was able to shape that discussion around the future of the UK. We certainly saw it in the Netherlands with the Green Party and the Freedom Party finding themselves in the runoff to the presidential elections, and all the elections that are coming up in 2017 in Europe, predominantly in the Netherlands and in France, are going to be shaped by these populist parties that, for the most part, hail from the far right or the extreme right. So there's tremendous amount of sort of coalition between these different parties and the outcomes of these votes and referenda.
But Dominic, if we look at what happened in Italy, it seems to be a little bit contradictory. Here we had Matteo Renzi, who may or may not be considered an establishment politician, trying to implement change, which was rejected by the electorate. So is that contradictory, or was this, as our reporter pointed out earlier on, some kind of power grab?
Well, I think it's both. I think what's so fascinating is that both the polling and also the outcomes of these elections or of these referenda don't follow any traditional path of logic. People often are voting even against their primary interests, and if there's something that Matteo Renzi did not learn by having this referendum, was what could potentially happen, as indeed happened with the Brexit vote. These have become opportunities for these non-establishment political parties to lobby against the establishment, and their anti-establishment platforms, along with their views on Europe, on immigration and so on, are captivating the electorate, often detracting from the main issues at stake, which was to reform the constitution, and most likely would have helped Italy move in a more positive direction. So the inclination, it would seem today, is to disrupt this political process. What we're left with at the end of it, though, are some serious questions about what these alternative parties actually are going to propose to the people, should they actually ever make it to the political structure.
Reinhard, if we look at the Austrian election, it pitted a far-right candidate, Norbert Hofer, against an independent former Green Party leader, Alexander van der Bellen, who was the candidate who ultimately won. But despite this result, was this election and its outcome a repudiation of Austria's mainstream political parties?
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly support that view. I mean, if on one level it was clearly a setback for the Freedom Party, but on the other hand, actually, it strengthens, or it will strengthen its hands in the upcoming parliamentary elections next year. And secondly, if we consider this a defeat or a setback, we have to redefine our conception of victory, because nearly 1 in every 2 Austrians have voted for the Freedom Party. But I think what we've seen in Austria, and that's a sort of response to what has been said before, is perhaps a sort of a negative Brexit and Trump effect that we've seen. I think had we had a much more positive reporting on the outcome of Brexit and the negative reporting on the election of Donald Trump in North America, in the US, we probably would have seen a victory by the Freedom Party. But I think people are stability-minded and are afraid of, and given all that's been changing, they prefer the devil they know to the devil they don't know. So this may actually open it up in terms of the outcomes of the elections next year in Germany and in France. So I don't know whether there's a limit, perhaps, of the kind of change, the amount of change people want to see.
So, Ansgar, we see the outcome of the Italian referendum, we see Brexit, we see growing support for conservatives, far-right groups in countries like Germany, like France, even in the Netherlands. So this sweep of anti-establishment sentiment, what's driving it?
I think there are different reasons, and one reason is Europe is facing several crises at this moment. There is the currency crisis. We are tending to forget this currency crisis due to this new crisis in regard to the refugees, but still this crisis exists with high unemployment rates, for example, especially in the southern countries of the European Union. And especially since 2015, we have this even more pressing crisis of this stream of refugees. And the people in a lot of European countries tend to think that the establishment politicians, the so-called establishment politicians, are not able to deal with these new problems. And the big question is whether you can form some new parties and they will be able to form with these problems. But I think at least we have to admit that European leaders, also for example the German politicians, made some mistakes when they underestimated the weight of this new crisis.
Paola, in Italy, look at politics in Italy. You got the anti-establishment five-star movement, as it's known. It got a quarter of the votes in Italy's last parliamentary election. That was in 2013, and it also won mayoral races in Turin and in Rome as well. What does that movement stand for?
Well, that's a very difficult question. It's actually a movement which has been established around a blog that this comedian, Beppe Grillo, started years ago, and has a very powerful messages, but you know, does he have a political program? No. Does he have an agenda? No. It's actually been, the movement has been to be against everything and against the established politicians. But, you know, I like to give a bit more of a more precise connotation about this establishment politician. In Italy, for many people, and many people who voted no, there is a very strict links between political life and corruption. There is a great deal of corruption into the public administration, despite attempt to clear up this corruption, but it's still there. There is a fundamental lack of transparency and accountability, and this is what people resent, and this is why people tend to follow these anti-establishment parties, because they feel that there is at least this party somehow express their feeling. There isn't any positive message, there isn't a program, there isn't an agenda, but at least people feel then they can express their discontent. Wrongly, but that's the reality.
Dominic, let's look at France as another example. I mean, there's a socialist right now in the Élysée Palace, but come the next presidential election, we'll have François Fillon, who will be up against, possibly up against Marine Le Pen, the far-right candidate. So that's a very sharp turn to the right in France. What happened there?
It is. And I think that the broader picture, in fact, is not simply an anti-establishment picture. I see an absolute move towards the right and towards far-right policies. In the last 20 years, we've essentially witnessed a collapse of the divisions between the traditional left and the traditional right. This means that, particularly around questions of economics, this means that many constituencies and communities, primarily working-class communities, feel that they've been abandoned by the left and under assault from the right. Attacks on welfare, and those kinds of critiques, and have become therefore very open to these kinds of populist agendas. But in addition to that, because these agendas don't just appeal, and it's a mistake to think about it in those ways, to working class communities, these particular agendas have been especially capable and astute at playing on notions, on ideas of fear around the questions of refugees and migrants, immigration, and especially around the question of Islam.
Okay.
If I may just add one point and one thing. If Marine Le Pen should win this election, and it could happen, then we would have to face something like a Frexit, France leaving the European Union, and that would not only change the political situation in France, but also the future of the European Union as a whole.
Okay, I want to talk about that in a moment. I also want to get the view from Austria, but first we're going to have to take a break. More of our conversation about populism in Europe and the future of the European Union right after that. Stay with us, you're watching The Heat.